Welcome to the week 4 feedback video. I'm Richard, and as you can see, Craig is not here this week. He's on a long haul flight, probably practicing some mindfulness right now at 40,000 feet. And we've got Adrian, one of our course mentors.
Hello.
And it's been a great week once again. Lots of interesting conversation coming up, Adrian. This week is usually a big one for a lot of our learners. You know, some of them really engage very well with the practices like self-compassion and loving kindness, and it also brings up quite a lot of stuff for people.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely seen that through the comments this week, and I've really been encouraged again with how all of the learners come in to support each other through this as well, either by offering some guidance or just sharing how normal some of these challenges can be.
Yeah, it's great to see, isn't it? Yeah. A lot of our learners talk about the strength of self-compassion and how that can actually be something that helps us to make us much more resilient and effective in the world.
Yeah, and there was one comment in particular that was well liked amongst the community, and I'll summarise some of the key messages here. They were really seeing self-compassion as an opportunity to drop that self-criticism that's really de-energizing and gets in the way of us learning and growing and changing. And as a result, self-compassion then is focused on supporting us to actually engage with the challenges in the present and find ways to learn and overcome challenges moving forward as well. And what do you sort of think on that?
Yeah, definitely. That self-criticism we use to motivate ourselves or avoid repeating mistakes a lot of the time, but it actually saps our self-esteem and makes us feel bad, stresses us out, and I think if we pay close attention, it actually makes us less effective at resolving things. Now, we need to, of course, differentiate self-compassion from things like self-pity and self-indulgence. You know, to be compassionate doesn't mean to sit around and sort of, ruminate or have a pity party. I mean, it's very much about recognizing that things are the way they are and getting on with, doing what needs to be done, but in a way where we're being kind to ourselves and accepting the humanness in failure and difficulty.
Oh, absolutely. And just on that as well, with some people thinking that perhaps self-compassion is something that's a bit weak in responsibility, these sorts of points that we're talking about here really emphasize how this can be a source of strength instead of a source of weakness.
Yeah. Of course, it's much easier to do with others than with ourselves. A lot of our learners through the activities noticed that it's often much easier to be compassionate to somebody else who's experiencing distress or suffering than it is to be like that with ourselves. And that's, of course, when we tend to rely on self-criticism.
Yeah, no, there was definitely a lot of comments coming through this week that emphasised that very point, that the part of the practice focusing on really giving and sharing intentions of wellness for others was quite straightforward in comparison to trying and directing that back to ourselves. So very common challenge, but do you have more that you want to share on that? Because certainly the additional resources that were provided in that particular step were well received.
Yeah, so Kristin Neff is one of the major researchers in the world around self-compassion. In fact, she started the field of self-compassion research, and so her resources are excellent. She's got meditations and a lot of really great articles that sort of clarify the distinction between self-compassion and self-criticism, self-compassion, self-pity, self-indulgence, that kind of thing. So a lot of our learners really like that, yeah. Is it strong or weak, Adrian? Might there be times when too much self-compassion could weaken that stiff upper lip resolve to cope with what life throws at us?
Yeah, and we've sort of been talking about that here. So where that stiff upper lip, resolve, resilience, even perhaps grit, where that's seen as the strong approach and self-compassion being different to that, I think the conversation we've been having here really evidences that self-compassion can be that source of strength that's brought to challenging situations for the self and of course in supporting others as well.
Definitely. And when it comes to compassion, there's compassion isn't allowing bad behaviour. It's not condoning bad behaviour, allowing sort of people to do things that don't serve us or serve them. In some of the traditional wisdom teachings, that there's sometimes a distinction made between idiot compassion and true compassion. You're walking along, you see someone in a hole, and idiot compassion would be to sort of think, oh, they feel bad, they probably need some company, I'll jump down in there with them, right? But I think real compassion might mean that you go and find a rope somewhere or raise the alarm, perhaps. So it's about acting skillfully.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to acting skillfully, this is where the self-care and care for others and how do we actually balance that and work with that dynamic came through as quite a strong theme as well. Did you have a particular comment on that? I've got some some learner comments that I can share, but I'm interested to know your perspective.
Definitely. Well, the research has found that the compassionate leaders are better leaders. You know, they inspire more trust, more loyalty. An article from the Harvard Business Review found that that's a very, it's a very powerful trait for leaders to have a bit of compassion. And also an interesting study found that students who fail a test and are then self-compassionate do better on the retest, because they don't waste time ruminating, beating themselves up, making themselves feel bad, making that revision sort of aversive, so they might just get to it tomorrow. They accept that they've failed and that that's human. They then acknowledge that, okay, they just need to get down and study and do better next time. And so, of course, they do better.
Mm-hmm. So that self-care focus actually helps the individual to move forward. And when it comes to actually looking at how you look after yourself, but then when you also need to look after others, whose needs come first, and how do you sort of walk that tightrope? There was some comments around that where perhaps giving to the self was seen as a challenge because they were giving so much to others. Did you have a comment on that at all?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think if mindfulness generally, when a lot of people start to practice, they find that just taking time for themselves is a bit of an obstacle, a bit of a barrier, even though they start to realize that they become more present and more productive and less reactive, and of course much better at being there for others. That first step of taking a few minutes out of the day to sit and do nothing, or take some time for their own self-care can be quite a challenge. And of course it's the same with self-care generally and caring for others. A lot of people feel really compelled to always be there for other people, and there's this belief perhaps that it's a little bit selfish to take time for themselves.
Yeah, and one learner in particular gave a great tip that was well liked, and I want to share that now. And it was that there was an opportunity to actually consider their own needs and even give their own needs in that moment a score out of 10. And then actually ask of the other person who has needs what score out of 10 they would give to that particular situation. And then essentially use that score to come up with a comparison. What do I service here? Is my need actually more important than theirs in this moment?
A nice algorithm for making
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Yeah. And I think also just paying attention to the effect that always being there for other people has on us. I mean, quite often we start to feel depleted. Perhaps we resent the other person on some level because we're not actually taking good care of our needs. So if we start to notice that, perhaps that starts to sort of inform our behaviour a little bit and mean that we might need, like being on a plane when the oxygen masks fall, the instructions, put yours on before the other person so that you can be in a better spot to help.
Yeah.
And of course with mindfulness we start to realise that that's very true.
Yeah, and actually that's sort of jogged my memory of something else that's come through this week, which is where some people believe, and this is perhaps due to their upbringing and where they've learnt the way that they talk to themselves from perhaps caregivers, but wanting to be independent and instead not actually welcome or allow the care and support of others. And so in situations where the self-compassionate response might actually be to allow others to support them, instead they're trying to independently get perspective on and perhaps even brush off the support coming from other people. And I think that's an interesting challenge to look at when it comes to actually self-compassion and giving yourself kindness by allowing other people in.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting again, isn't it, that with mindfulness we do something that's about us. We take that time to be with ourselves, to notice what's happening, but very quickly it becomes about others. It becomes about how we communicate, how we connect, how we relate to other people. And we realise perhaps that that it's not the best thing to be isolated from other people all the time and trying to always just take care of ourselves or to be completely reliant on people all the time. I think we start to get a bit of an intuitive feel for what's appropriate, how much self-care we need to be doing, how much caring for others, how much we need to allow others to care for us, and how much responsibility we need to take for ourselves.
Yeah, and that actually links usefully to a little poem that was shared that was well liked in the community as well, that really shows that it does come back to us, and then with that understanding of ourselves, how do we engage with other people?
What's the poem?
The quote, well, the poem was, or a classic quote, it was shared: "Love many, trust a few, and always paddle your own canoe." And one of the comments that came through on the back of that was essentially to show that we owe it to ourselves to be our best friend, to actually look after ourselves,
To
because
be our
at the
own
end of the
best
day,
friend.
yeah. And that will support us in paddling our own canoe. And then we do have those opportunities to, as we're paddling around, engage with other people that we trust and show care and love to others as well.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the way that we relate to ourselves is the way, really, that we relate to others. So if we're dismissive or critical or perfectionistic with ourselves, that's how we will tend to be with other people. So if we can change that relationship with ourselves, then, of course, we can have better relationships with others. Because if we start to pay attention, we realise that a lot of the time, and particularly when things are hard, we're often not our own best friend. We're our own best sort of critic. But to cultivate this ability to be completely present and kind towards ourselves, self-compassionate when things are hard, it's a strong resource, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
The loving kindness practices, these are interesting. They bring up a lot for people. Some learners really love them and engage well with them, and others, it can bring up quite a lot, as you noticed during the week.
So overwhelmingly, the positive side of things, people were feeling this real sense of tranquility. And then there were a couple of themes to do with challenges, and I'd really love your perspective on those.
Yeah. Well, three main concerns came up. One is about sort of the practices almost seeming a little bit religious, almost like praying or something like that. But just to clarify with loving kindness meditation, what we're doing is we're making wishes. So we're thinking good thoughts, you could say, about wishing for the happiness of others, and just practicing that, so that if anything we practice over time becomes easier and will ultimately start to just become a natural habit. And of course, if we can genuinely wish others well, even when they're difficult people, well, that can sometimes be a strength.
Yeah.
The perceived lack of science. So, I mean, there's a lot of science now on loving kindness meditation. Benefits for psychological health, more positive emotions, less self-criticism. It can help with PTSD. It can even reduce some of the negative symptoms of psychosis. Socially, it improves social connectedness, empathy and compassion. It reduces cognitive bias, strengthens the emotion regulation areas in the brain. Makes us more helpful. It can even help with physical things like migraines and chronic pain. And one study even shows that it slows the aging process. So there's certainly a lot of science around that, and we'll put a link to a digest of that research.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. And of course, this week, very topically, there have been some terrorist incidents around the world, and a lot of people are sort of questioning, well, how do you make wishes for the happiness of someone who's causing great harm to someone else?
Yeah, and this challenge is significant, absolutely, and it was referenced a lot in the comments. And for some, they believed that it would probably be better for themselves not to engage in these practices at this point in time, and as a result, and every learner is welcome to take this course and the different exercises at their own pace.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, there were some learners that were really curious to understand, well, how do I approach this then within this context?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of important things to keep in mind with a practice like loving kindness for difficult people. One is that, if we can recognise that difficult people are unhappy people, right? That's an important starting point. So you think about the people in your life who are difficult. They tend to be pretty unhappy, caught up in their own fixed ideas and reactions. And the people who are happy tend to be easy to be around, right? So even though it's really sort of counterintuitive in a way and can seem a bit unusual, to wish happiness for people that are causing harm actually makes sense logically when you boil it down like that. But a disclaimer, all of the classic teachings around loving kindness say, don't start with your worst enemy. You can't. You try to do that, it just feels ridiculous, right? Start with somebody perhaps who you just have a little bit of conflict with, something unresolved, some mild disagreement, and even that can be challenging enough.
Yeah.
But once that starts to become easier, of course, then you can start to broaden that scope. And of course, you hear these stories about Tibetan monks who, fleeing Tibet and were imprisoned by the Chinese and tortured for years at a time, and, had these heinous experiences. And yet some of them talk in this way where they had nothing but compassion for their jailers. They could see that these people were caught up in their own limited beliefs and were causing suffering for themselves because they were causing suffering for others. And so that's where this can go.
Yeah. And so it is important to recognise that we're all on our own path, learning and making progress as we practice these different exercises. For some, we're seeing that there's actually a lot of normality in our experiences through the support that we get from the learners in the community. And for others, they may wish to actually continue on with earlier practices and return to this perhaps at a time when other challenges to do with
the
likes
world
of terrorism
situation.
have progressed on a little
Yes.
bit, and it's not as significant right here.
That's a great point. And a lot of our learners have said that, because a lot of our learners repeat this course a number of times, and some of them have said that early on this was too much for them, but they've come back to it later and then found these to be some of the most profoundly, transformative and positive practices in the course. So I think that's really good advice. But, just in closing, the world needs more mindfulness. It needs more compassion, needs more loving kindness. So we'd strongly encourage all of our learners to keep practicing whichever practices make sense and seem to be benefiting you. Keep practicing them and being the change in the world. And at least, doing that, things will upset us less as well, as we get less caught up in fear and that kind of thing. So once again, it's been really great, all of the learning, sharing and support on the forums, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah.